Marine Corporal Sarah Mitchell gripped her rifle tighter as the armored vehicle bounced along the dusty road outside Fallujah. The August heat, in 2004, made the inside of the Humvee feel like an oven, even with the air conditioning running. She was 23 years old, a communications specialist on her second deployment to Iraq. Her job was to maintain radio contact between different units, ensuring that everyone stayed connected during operations. The convoy consisted of 4 vehicles carrying supplies to a forward operating base. Sarah rode in the third vehicle, constantly monitoring radio chatter and updating their position to command. The landscape outside looked empty, but she knew that could change in seconds. Fallujah had become one of the most dangerous places in Iraq, with insurgent attacks happening daily. Her squad leader, Sergeant Martinez, sat across from her, his eyes scanning the road ahead through the bulletproof windows. He had been in Iraq for 8 months and had seen too many ambushes to let his guard down. The driver, Private Johnson, kept checking his mirrors nervously. This was only his 3rd mission outside the wire, and the tension was written all over his young face. Sarah's radio crackled with updates from the lead vehicle. Everything seemed normal. Just another supply run through hostile territory. She had done dozens of these missions before. And while they were always dangerous, most ended without incident. The key was staying alert and following protocols. As they approached a bend in the road, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach tighten. A small pile of debris on the side of the road looked different from the usual trash. It was too neat, too deliberately placed. She had been trained to spot signs of improvised explosive devices, and this looked suspicious. She was reaching for her radio to report the possible threat when the world exploded around her. The lead vehicle had triggered a massive roadside bomb, sending pieces of metal and debris flying in all directions. The blast was so powerful that it flipped the second vehicle onto its side and sent a shockwave through Sarah's Humvee that threw everyone against the walls. Before anyone could recover from the first explosion, gunfire erupted from both sides of the road. Muzzle flashes came from hidden positions in the buildings and behind concrete barriers. The insurgents had planned a perfect ambush, using the bomb to stop the convoy and then attacking with small arms fire. Sergeant Martinez was shouting orders, but Sarah could barely hear him over the ringing in her ears from the explosion. She could see his mouth moving and knew he was telling everyone to return fire and find cover. The driver was slumped over the wheel, blood running down his face from where flying glass had cut him. Sarah grabbed her rifle and tried to position herself to shoot back at their attackers. Through the bulletproof windows, she could see masked figures moving between buildings, firing AK-47 seconds at the convoy. The sound of bullets hitting their vehicle was like deadly rain, a constant pinging and cracking that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The radio was filled with frantic calls for help. The lead vehicle crew was calling for medical evacuation, reporting multiple casualties. The second vehicle was on its side and not responding to radio calls at all. Sarah's vehicle was still functional, but they were pinned down by heavy gunfire from at least a dozen different positions. Sergeant Martinez made a decision that would save some lives but put others at greater risk. He ordered the driver to reverse and try to create some distance from the kill zone. The injured driver, fighting through his pain and disorientation, managed to throw the vehicle into reverse and stepped on the gas. As they backed away from the ambush site, Sarah continued trying to raise help on the radio. She could hear other units responding, saying they were on their way, but she knew it would take time for reinforcements to arrive. In Fallujah, even a few minutes could mean the difference between life and death. That's when Sarah made the decision that would change everything. Looking at the overturned second vehicle through her scope, she could see movement inside. Someone was still alive in there, probably injured and unable to get out. The insurgents were moving closer to that vehicle, and she knew they would either capture or kill anyone they found. Without waiting for orders, Sarah kicked open the rear door of her Humvee. Sergeant Martinez grabbed for her, shouting that it was too dangerous, but she was already out and running toward the overturned vehicle. She knew it was probably a suicide mission, but she couldn't abandon her fellow Marines. The distance between the vehicles was only about 50 meters. but it felt like a mile under the intense gunfire. Sarah ran in a zigzag pattern, using every bit of cover she could find. Bullets kicked up dust all around her feet, and she could hear them whizzing past her head. One round came so close it tore through her sleeve without touching her skin. She reached the overturned vehicle and immediately saw the problem. The gunner, Corporal Davis, was trapped inside with his leg pinned under heavy equipment. He was conscious, but losing blood fast. The driver and passenger were both unconscious, and she couldn't tell if they were alive. Sarah knew she had to work fast. The insurgents were getting closer, and she could hear their voices shouting to each other in Arabic. She managed to free Corporal Davis's leg and started dragging him out of the wreckage. He was a big man, much heavier than her, but adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she had. Just as she got Davis clear of the vehicle, the insurgents reached their position. Sarah spun around with her rifle ready, but there were too many of them. She managed to shoot 2 of the attackers before a burst of automatic gunfire caught her in the chest and abdomen. The impact threw her backward, and she felt like she had been hit by a truck. Even as she fell, Sarah kept fighting. She rolled behind the overturned vehicle and continued shooting at the insurgents, trying to protect Davis, who was too injured to fight back. She could feel warm blood soaking through her uniform, but she refused to give up. Every shot she fired might buy them a few more seconds for help to arrive. The firefight continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Sarah was hit again, this time in the shoulder and leg. The pain was incredible, but she kept her focus on staying alive and protecting her injured comrade. She could hear helicopters in the distance, which meant help was coming, but she wasn't sure if they would make it in time. When the insurgents realized that reinforcements were approaching, they began to withdraw. But before leaving, they fired several more bursts at Sarah's position. More bullets found their mark, hitting her in the arm and torso. By the time the shooting stopped, she had been wounded 11 times. But she was still conscious and still breathing. Corporal Davis, despite his own serious injuries, managed to apply pressure to some of Sarah's worst wounds using torn pieces of his uniform. He kept talking to her, telling her to stay awake and that help was coming. Through her fading vision, Sarah could see smoke rising from the other vehicles and knew that this ambush had been devastating for her unit. The last thing she remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of boots running toward them and someone shouting for a medic. Help had finally arrived, but Sarah's real fight for survival was just beginning. As darkness closed in around her, she didn't know if she would ever see another sunrise. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, floating between darkness and brief moments of painful awareness. Sometimes, she could hear voices around her, speaking in urgent tones about blood pressure, oxygen levels, and surgical procedures. Other times, there was only silence and the steady beeping of medical equipment that seemed to come from very far away. The field medics who first reached the ambush site had worked frantically to stabilize her before transport. They had never seen anyone survive 11 gunshot wounds. And honestly, they didn't expect Sarah to make it to the hospital. One bullet had passed through her lung, another had damaged her liver, and several others had caused severe bleeding in her abdomen and extremities. During the helicopter ride to the military hospital in Baghdad, Sarah flatlined twice. Each time, the flight medic managed to restart her heart with electric shocks and continued pumping blood and fluids into her body. Her blood pressure kept dropping dangerously low, and she was losing blood faster than they could replace it. At the hospital, a team of military surgeons took over her care. Dr. Captain Reynolds, who had been operating on combat casualties for 6 months, later said that Sarah's case was the most challenging he had ever encountered. The bullets had caused damage to multiple organs, and stopping the internal bleeding required hours of delicate surgery. The first operation lasted 9 hours. The surgical team had to remove damaged sections of her intestines, repair her liver, and reinflate her collapsed lung. They found bullet fragments scattered throughout her torso, some dangerously close to major blood vessels and her spine. Removing all the fragments would require several more surgeries over the coming weeks. When Sarah woke up 3 days after the ambush, she was connected to machines that were helping her breathe and monitoring every aspect of her vital signs. Her entire body felt like it was on fire, and even the smallest movement caused excruciating pain. She tried to speak but found that she had a tube down her throat to help her breathe. A nurse named Lieutenant Wilson was the first person Sarah saw when she opened her eyes. Wilson had been caring for wounded soldiers for over a year and had seen many miraculous recoveries. But Sarah's survival seemed impossible. She gently explained to Sarah where she was and what had happened, speaking slowly and clearly so the injured Marine could understand despite her medication-induced confusion. The news about her unit was devastating. 2 Marines from the lead vehicle had been killed instantly in the bomb explosion. The driver of her own vehicle, Private Johnson, had died from his injuries during transport to the hospital. Corporal Davis, whom she had risked her life to save, was alive but had lost his leg below the knee. Sergeant Martinez had survived with minor injuries and had been asking about Sarah constantly since the attack. Recovery was slow and painful. Sarah had to relearn basic functions that she had taken for granted her entire life. Breathing without machine assistance was her first major challenge. The damage to her lung made every breath feel like drowning, and she often panicked when the breathing tube was removed for short periods. Physical therapy began while she was still bedridden. A specialist named Staff Sergeant Williams worked with Sarah to prevent her muscles from deteriorating completely during her long recovery. Even simple exercises like moving her fingers or flexing her feet were agony, but Williams pushed her gently but persistently to keep her body functioning. The psychological impact was just as challenging as the physical recovery. Sarah experienced nightmares every time she closed her eyes, reliving the ambush over and over again. She would wake up screaming, thinking she could still hear gunfire and explosions. The hospital's mental health team worked with her daily to help process the trauma of what she had experienced. During her second week in the hospital, Sarah received a visit that lifted her spirits considerably. Corporal Davis, using a wheelchair and accompanied by a nurse, came to see the woman who had saved his life. Despite his own pain and the loss of his leg, he was more concerned about Sarah's condition than his own. Davis told her that her actions during the ambush had been reported up the chain of command. Word was spreading throughout the military about the Marine who had survived 11 gunshot wounds after running into enemy fire to save a fellow soldier. Her story was becoming legendary among the troops in Iraq, a symbol of courage and determination in the face of impossible odds. But Sarah didn't feel like a hero. She felt broken and scared, unsure if she would ever be able to function normally again. The doctors were honest with her about the long road ahead. She would need months of rehabilitation, additional surgeries to remove remaining bullet fragments, and extensive physical therapy to regain her strength and mobility. Her family was notified about her injuries and flew to Germany when she was transferred to a larger military medical facility there for specialized treatment. Seeing her parents and younger brother for the first time since her deployment was emotional for everyone. They had been told she might not survive, so being able to hold her hand and talk to her felt like a miracle. The German hospital had more advanced equipment and specialists who were experts in treating complex combat injuries. Sarah underwent 2 more major surgeries to repair damage to her digestive system and remove additional bullet fragments that were causing complications. Each operation was risky because her body was still weak from the initial trauma and blood loss. Between surgeries, Sarah began working with a counselor who specialized in combat trauma. These sessions were difficult because they required her to talk about the attack and confront her fears about returning to normal life. She worried that she would never be strong enough to serve as a Marine again, and she struggled with survivor's guilt about the Marines who had died in the ambush. Physical therapy became more intensive as her condition improved. Sarah had to relearn how to walk, starting with taking just a few steps with the help of parallel bars and gradually building up her strength and endurance. Her left leg had been severely damaged by one of the bullets, and doctors weren't sure if she would ever walk normally again. The breakthrough came during her 6th week of recovery. Sarah managed to walk across the entire physical therapy room without assistance, something that had seemed impossible just days earlier. Her physical therapist and medical team cheered when she completed the walk, and Sarah cried tears of joy and relief. It was the first time since the attack that she truly believed she might recover completely. News of her progress reached her unit back in Iraq, where the surviving members of her convoy were continuing their mission despite the loss of their friends. They sent messages of support and encouragement, telling her that her bravery had inspired them to keep fighting despite the dangers they faced every day. As Sarah's physical condition improved, she began to think about what would happen when she was finally discharged from the hospital. The Marine Corps had indicated that she would receive a medical retirement due to the severity of her injuries. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up her military career. She had joined the Marines to serve her country, and she wasn't finished with that mission yet. The doctors warned her that returning to active duty might not be possible, given the permanent damage to some of her organs and the ongoing effects of her injuries. But Sarah was determined to prove them wrong. She pushed herself harder in physical therapy, working extra hours to rebuild her strength and endurance. Her goal was not just to recover, but to come back stronger than ever. During her final week in Germany, Sarah received word that the Navy SEALs had been conducting operations in the area where her convoy was attacked. Intelligence indicated that the insurgent group responsible for the ambush was still active in that region, planning additional attacks on American forces. This news made her recovery feel even more urgent. Her fellow Marines were still in danger, and she wanted to get back to help them. 2 months after the ambush that nearly killed her, Sarah Mitchell made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her story. Against the advice of her doctors and the direct orders of her commanding officer, she requested to return to Iraq to finish her deployment. The Marine Corps initially refused, citing her medical condition and the need for additional recovery time. Sarah spent weeks fighting the bureaucracy, appealing to higher and higher levels of command. She underwent extensive medical evaluations to prove that she was fit for duty, despite still carrying bullet fragments in her body that were too dangerous to remove surgically. Her determination impressed even the doctors who had initially declared her unfit for combat operations. The breakthrough came when Sergeant Martinez, who had been promoted after the ambush, personally vouched for Sarah's abilities and mental state. He had served with her for over a year and believed that her experience and courage would be valuable assets in their ongoing mission. His recommendation, combined with Sarah's persistent appeals, finally convinced the command structure to allow her return. When Sarah stepped off the transport plane at the military base near Fallujah, she felt a mixture of emotions that surprised her. There was fear, certainly, but also a sense of coming home. This dangerous place had become where she belonged. And being away from her unit, while they continued to face daily threats, had been almost unbearable. Her return created quite a stir among the troops. Word had spread throughout the military community about the Marine who had survived 11 bullet wounds, and many soldiers wanted to meet the woman who had become a symbol of resilience and determination. Sarah was uncomfortable with the attention but understood that her story had meaning for others facing their own challenges. The base had changed significantly during her absence. Security had been increased following several successful insurgent attacks, and new defensive positions had been constructed around the perimeter. The tempo of operations had also intensified, with units conducting more frequent patrols and raids to disrupt enemy activities in the region. Sarah's first mission back was intentionally low risk, a routine patrol through a relatively secure area near the base. Her squad leader wanted to ease her back into operations gradually, but Sarah insisted that she was ready for whatever mission the unit needed her to complete. She had not survived 11 gunshot wounds just to play it safe when her fellow Marines were still in danger. During her second week back, intelligence reports indicated that the insurgent group responsible for her convoy ambush was planning a major attack on a coalition supply route. This was the same group that had killed her friends and nearly killed her, and Sarah volunteered immediately when her unit was tasked with disrupting their operation. The mission required a multi-day operation in hostile territory, setting up observation posts to monitor insurgent movement and calling in airstrikes when targets were identified. Sarah's job was to maintain communications between the different teams and coordinate with air support when needed. It was exactly the type of dangerous mission that doctors had said she would never be able to handle again. On the second night of the operation, Sarah's team observed a large group of insurgents moving weapons and explosives toward the main supply route. These were the same tactics used in the ambush that had nearly killed her, and she recognized the methodical way the enemy was positioning their forces for maximum effectiveness. As Sarah coordinated the airstrike that would eliminate the threat, she felt a sense of completion that had been missing since her injury. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting other American soldiers from experiencing what she and her convoy had gone through. Every insurgent eliminated tonight was one less threat to future convoys traveling this dangerous road. The airstrike was devastatingly effective, eliminating the entire insurgent group and their weapons cache. Intelligence later confirmed that this operation had prevented what would have been one of the largest and most deadly attacks in the region. Sarah's communications work had been instrumental in the mission's success, proving that she had indeed returned to full effectiveness as a Marine. Word of Sarah's successful return to combat operations reached the highest levels of military leadership. Her story became part of military training programs, used to teach other soldiers about resilience, determination, and the warrior ethos that defines the Marine Corps. She had not only survived an impossible situation, but had returned stronger than ever. 6 months after her return to Iraq, Sarah received word that Navy SEALs had conducted a raid in the area where her original ambush had occurred. The timing was significant. It was almost exactly 2 years after the attack that had nearly killed her. The SEALs had been tracking remaining members of the insurgent network and had finally located their leadership. During the SEAL operation, they discovered intelligence that provided new details about the ambush that had wounded Sarah. The insurgents had been planning that attack for weeks, studying convoy patterns and timing their assault for maximum casualties. They had expected to kill everyone in the convoy and had been surprised that anyone survived, particularly someone who had fought back as effectively as Sarah had. The intelligence also revealed something that amazed everyone who reviewed it. In the immediate aftermath of the ambush, insurgent communications had referred to Sarah as the warrior woman who would not die. They had shot her 11 times and left her for dead, but when they returned to the site hours later to collect weapons and intelligence, they found evidence that she had survived and continued fighting. This revelation helped Sarah understand something important about her survival and recovery. It wasn't just medical treatment and determination that had saved her life. It was the fighting spirit that had kept her going even when death seemed certain. That same spirit had driven her to return to Iraq and complete her mission, despite every reasonable argument for staying safe at home. As her deployment neared its end, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day when bullets had torn through her body. She had discovered reserves of strength and courage that she hadn't known existed. And she had proven that the human spirit could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Her survival had inspired countless other wounded warriors to keep fighting through their own recoveries. The day before her unit was scheduled to return to the United States, Sarah visited the site where her convoy had been ambushed 2 years earlier. The road had been rebuilt and was now much safer, with improved security measures that made attacks like the one she had survived much less likely. Standing there, she felt a sense of peace that had been missing since her injury. Sarah completed her military service with full honors, retiring as a staff sergeant after 8 years in the Marine Corps. Her decorations included the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat and the Bronze Star for her actions during the ambush. But the recognition that meant the most to her came from Corporal Davis, who told her that saving his life had given him the chance to marry his girlfriend and start a family. After leaving the military, Sarah became a counselor for wounded veterans, using her experience to help others work through the trauma and challenges of recovering from combat injuries. She often told her clients that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the toughest. It was about refusing to give up, even when giving up seemed like the only reasonable option. The story of the Marine who survived 11 bullet wounds became part of military history, told and retold in training programs and ceremonies around the world. But for Sarah, the real victory wasn't surviving the bullets or even returning to combat. It was proving that the human spirit, when tested by the worst possible circumstances, could not only endure, but emerge stronger than ever before. Years later, when young Marines would ask her for advice about facing their fears in combat, Sarah would tell them something simple but profound. You're stronger than you know, and you can survive more than you think. The only thing that can truly defeat you is giving up on yourself. It was a lesson written in scars and bullet fragments, paid for with blood and pain, but validated by an extraordinary life lived with courage and purpose.